Bibracte. Imagine building a massive Iron Age capital, hosting political drama that would make HBO jealous, getting name-dropped by Julius Caesar himself, and then abandoning the entire city like a bad group chat. This is Bibracte, the ancient city that said, "I'm good, thanks," and vanished into the woods for 2,000 years. My name is Ancient Swan, thank you for coming. That was my attempt at a hook, and let's get stuck in. Today we're climbing up Mont Beuvray to uncover the story of Bibracte, the ancient Aedui capital that rose to power, hosted Gaul's biggest political meltdown, and then noped out of existence so hard that archaeologists had to rediscover it twice. Bibracte was the capital of the Aedui, a tribe who looked at a perfectly normal landscape and said, No, put the city on top of the mountain, higher, higher, yes, right where the wind can slap us in the face every morning. Bibracte wasn't just a hill fort, it was the Silicon Valley of Iron Age Gaul, and at its time was one of the most important cities in all of what we now call France. Carbon dating tells us that the city was initially founded at some time around 300 BC, almost 2,500 years ago. However, there is also evidence of earlier settlement going all the way back to the Stone Age, perched on a scenic mountain full of artisans, politicians, and people who definitely thought they were cooler than the tribes next door. The Aedui were part of the Tène culture, which means excellent metalwork, questionable hairstyles, and a deep love of building things on top of windy mountains because everybody and their gran knows that rock-solid nipples cut better glass windows. Initially, the Aedui tribe and their capital city had an official empire status of friend of the Roman people, which sounds fancy, and was more than enough to keep the Aedui and Bibracte out of war in those initial years of Roman conquest. The Romans agreed that since the Aedui were nice to them, they would return the favour by not murdering them all and throwing their heads into a stew, which is just all-round good manners. I'm sure we can agree. This alliance wasn't new either by the point that Julius Caesar arrived. The Romans and Aedui's alliance was already more than 200 years old. The Aedui were a powerful tribe, and Bibracte was the source of that power, lying as it did at a crossroads uniting the furthest reaches of what we now call France. And being friendly with the Romans kept that route open and trade flowing through it. However, as almost always when the Romans were involved, peace was not guaranteed forever. In 58 BC, Julius Caesar fought the Helvetii near here, and by near, I mean not near, not here, but over there, 16 miles away. But Caesar named the battle after Bibracte anyway, because accuracy is optional when you're busy conquering Europe and writing your own fan fiction about it. Imagine being so powerful, you can just rename battles like you're editing a Google Doc. Yeah, I know it happened 16 miles away, but Bibracte sounds cooler, so deal with it. Before the Roman conquest of Gaul, Bibracte had a population of more than 30,000 souls, none of whom had heard of a baguette. But they still knew how to roll. Despite this city's privileged status as friend of the Roman people, peace would not last forever. For within the ranks of the Aedui lay an ever-growing group of men who'd rather be a Roman enemy than a friend. Fast forward to 52 BC, just a few years after Julius Caesar had shown a spectacular disregard for geographical accuracy, the Gauls decided to stick together as one and throw the Romans out for good. A bunch of Gallic leaders gathered here at Bibracte, probably arguing about who brought what to the potluck, and suddenly decided, you know what, let's put the tall guy with the hair in charge, and boom, Vercingetorix becomes leader of the anti-Roman coalition. Think of Vercingetorix as a kind of Braveheart of the Gauls, a strong, charismatic leader who had the balls to stand up and shout, "Screw those guys, join with me if you want to live." And so it was that the Gallic tribes united under one banner and began the Gallic revolt. Despite some early successes, such as the butchering of Romans at the Battle of Bibracte, the revolt was ultimately doomed, and the Gauls went on to lose anyway. The final loss came at the Battle of Autun, later that same year, when Vercingetorix willingly handed himself over to the Romans in order to spare the lives of his remaining men. The great Gaulish leader was taken back to Rome, where he was imprisoned for a while before executed. Needless to say, to this day, Vercingetorix is lauded as a hero amongst the French people, and it all started here at Bibracte. Would I follow Vercingetorix into battle? Absolutely not. I'd be in the back pretending to tie my shoelaces like, "Sorry lads, twisted my ankle, can't die today. Maybe tomorrow though." How about you? Would you be with the Gauls charging into a Roman legion, or would you also be shouting that you have bone spurs? Despite this city's role in the Gallic wars, the Romans continued to treat the city with mercy and allowed its inhabitants a peaceful life, perhaps as a result of the friendly relationship they'd had before things started getting stabby. In fact, in his book titled Commentaries on the Gallic Wars, Julius Caesar refers to the Aedui as our blood brothers, showing just how connected he considered themselves to be. After the Romans conquered Gaul, they built a shiny new city nearby at Autun, with better roads, more marble, and fewer trees trying to kill you in the wind. And the Aedui, well, they actually moved. They just packed up the entire city and left. Bibracte went from capital of a major tribe to that place we used to live. Faster than you can say, "Please stop hitting me with your giant Roman javelin." Imagine abandoning your whole city because the Romans built a nicer one a few miles away. Peak Iron Age gentrification. Would I abandon my entire city because the Romans built a shinier one? Yes, immediately. If I had to climb this mountain every day, I'd abandon that exercise in a heartbeat. Don't pretend you wouldn't abandon your city too. I see you, lying on your sofa, high as shit, watching YouTube. Despite the fact that most of the inhabitants had upped sticks and moved, there is evidence that this place remained a ritual site where the people would return periodically to worship their gods. In fact, there is written evidence in the medieval ages that even more than 1,000 years after the Roman forced abandonment of the city, the local people were still coming to Bibracte for a festival on the first Monday of every May, every year, year after year, upholding a tradition dating back to when their ancestors had counted this mountaintop as their capital city, showing that although the city was gone and its inhabitants long forgotten, there were still those who revered its ancient history and importance of its place in time. And so, for nearly 2,000 years, Bibracte sat quietly under a forest, minding its own business, probably relieved to no longer host political drama. Then archaeologists rediscovered the ancient city in the late 19th century, before promptly going on to forget about it again, before eventually remembering what they'd forgotten and going back to dig everything back up once more in the 1980s. At this point, Bibracte has been found more times than my Monday morning motivation. In the late 1800s, archaeologists eventually pinpointed the site and uncovered public buildings so that locals could gather and scream about politics, as well as workshops for crafting weapons and questionable pottery, and houses with perfectly designed Iron Age open-plan living. And don't forget the religious spaces, because mysterious pits are a cultural universal. Bibracte wasn't just a random hill fort. It was a full city with infrastructure, trade, and enough drama to fill a Netflix series. It had great walls, great roads, a forum, a basilica, and aqueduct. It had rich people, and it had poor people, all struggling to survive in a world perched atop a first-century mountain. And then came World War I, which, as we all know, got a wee bit deathly for some folks. One of those folks being the chief archaeologist of Bibracte, who was killed during the war. The excavations then fell into neglect, and it was not until the 1980s that archaeologists returned, and oh boy did they go on to find some stuff. They have found that this city had 2 consecutive rings of defensive walls built in the Morus Gallicus style, because apparently 1 wall is not enough and 3 is taking the piss. As well as this, many homes have been found, revealing entire neighborhoods dedicated to highly specialized metalworking and artisan lodgings. Mostly built from wood and earth, the homes of the people who lived here were relatively basic, as stone was reserved for the defensive walls. And then there's this, the monumental basin. found at the junction of the city's main streets, which archaeologists think had a sacred function. But bloody hell, the archaeologists will say this about literally everything. Today, Bibracte is one of the best studied Iron Age sites in Europe. It's scenic, dramatic, historically important, and has the energy of a place that's seen some things and would prefer not to talk about them. The site is now an archaeological park at the centre of a protected forest. It is also a well-known training ground for young archaeologists who come from all over the world to practice digging holes, pointing at things and exclaiming, "Look what I found." Which is fair enough. Even archaeologists need a hole to practice on, so why not here at Bibracte? And the hole digging discoveries are far from over. Because just recently as I write this, in October 2025, archaeologists uncovered part of the long-lost aqueduct of Bibracte, as well as remains of a Roman basilica, where locals of the time gathered to buy and sell wares, as well as shout about how great it was to not be dead, and how great the Romans were for providing such a privilege. And with fingers crossed, I'm sure there will still be many more amazing discoveries to make. And so that was the story of Bibracte, an ancient capital and city that went on to make a habit of hiding, and there's not many inanimate objects can make that claim. But have we learned anything today? Of course. What kind of crap do you think I'm pulling where nobody learns a lesson? For one, we've learned that if your city is on a windy mountain, you will eventually regret it. The Aedui basically invented location regret, centuries before real estate agents existed. We've also been reminded that Iron Age people were just like us. Dramatic, petty, and allergic to bad infrastructure. Civilization changes, people don't. How about you? If you had to live in an Iron Age city, would you pick the dramatic mountaintop vibe, or are you more of a flat land with fewer hypothermia risks person? Anyway, that is pretty much it for Bibracte, and it's time for me to run away yet again, but not before reminding everyone how amazing it is to be a Patreon of this channel, the greatest among whom currently have their names running across the screen. God bless these people. A million billion thanks to these Patreons for giving me the will to wake up in the mornings. Right then, I'll be off for now. Thanks for coming. Be sure to come back next time. Peace, love, and Bibracte. Goodbye.